Hey, good morning, class. I hope and pray that everyone is doing well. I hope that you had a wonderful Easter. I know it was certainly a different Easter than what we are accustomed to, but I hope it still was a blessed day for you. Hopefully you were able to just gather around the Word and maybe gather around the table and enjoy a meal together. I know that we tried to sort of replicate our traditional Easter meal, but it was just the four of us here together. And again, we had a great time over the last week. Justin turned 13, and so that was a big deal for us. Certainly a big deal for him. But we're all healthy. I pray that you are at home and healthy as well as we just continue to work through this coronavirus quarantine. I've heard, in the last couple of days that some think we're maybe over the hump in Georgia. I don't know if that's the case or not. It would seem it would take a little bit longer to determine that, but hopefully they're right, and hopefully we're on the back side of this. And I pray that we can be back at church soon. Pray that we can be back in Sunday school soon. But in the meantime, I hope these videos are a blessing to you. I pray that it helps us continue on our study in the book of Genesis. And today we're in Genesis 9:18 through 29. And this is a really interesting, just very brief episode in the book of Genesis. We've been working through the life of Noah, and we have seen him really just display such righteousness, such a Godward focus. And that's a phrase that I'll probably use several times in this brief lesson, is a Godward life or a Godward focus, because we see Noah focused on God. We see all the way back in Genesis 6 when the world, essentially the entire world, according to the Word, was rebelling against God. What do we see Noah doing? We see him focusing his life on God. We see him walking with God, declared to be a man of righteousness. But when we come to this text, verses 18 through 29 in chapter 9, we see him post-flood. So we see the waters of the flood have receded. We're told, and I'll read the text in just a moment, we're told that he becomes a man of the soil. So he begins to plant. You can only imagine that would seem logical. After being on a boat for so long, he probably just wanted to get his hands dirty, right? But he plants a vineyard, among other things. And we're going to see him in at least one episode take his eyes off of Jesus. And I just want to emphasize that I don't believe this text is meant to cast a negative light on Noah's life, or because he lives for, I believe, another 350 years after these events, and we'll see that at the end of the text. But it's an episode of his life, and it's not the highlight of his life by any means, but it paints a picture for us. And I think it serves as a good reminder to us about the need to finish strong, the need to keep our eyes set squarely upon Jesus. And it shows us the dangers of what happens when we don't do that. And so let's jump into the text. Here we go. Starting with verse 18. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan, and that's important because it's Canaan who is going to receive a curse from Noah after these events. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these people of the whole earth was dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Let's just stop right there, just unpack the text just briefly. So again, we've seen him become, Noah that is, become a man of the soil. He plants a vineyard, and he drank some of the wine, and he drank it to the point of becoming drunk and lay uncovered. Now what that means is he exposed himself in some way, exposed his nakedness in some way in his tent. You can almost picture him maybe falling down on a bed or a mat, in kind of a drunken stupor, if you will, and he kind of unknowingly uncovered his nakedness. And then we see Ham, and we're not told all of the ins and outs of this story, but Ham is walks into the tent, sees his father, and then goes out and tells his two brothers. And so it's definitely, we don't have a lot of the details, but why did Ham walk in? Well, that we don't really know, and I don't know if there's much need in speculating. But let's continue with the text, because then we see Shem and Japheth. They took a very different approach. They're told by their brother what has happened, and so they took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So it's definitely a different response. And I think the one thing we can conclude is that for whatever led Ham into seeing his father, it's how he responded that's the problem. He responded by, rather than trying to cover up his father's nakedness and I hate this phrase, cover up the sin, but just protect him in that regard, and then walk out and not say anything. He walks out and for some reason finds it necessary to tell his brothers. Now again, we would have to start using our sanctified imagination there a little bit to fill in what kind of temperament he had when he told them, what his motivation was. I don't think that's helpful, because when we see Shem and Japheth's response, we see a clear difference. They were concerned about the righteousness of their father. They were concerned about what was going on in his life and what could bring kind of repute upon his character. So they took means. When they walked into the tent, they knew what was ahead of them. And so they took means to protect themselves from uncovering their father's nakedness, and they wanted to care for him. So it's a very different mentality. Let's keep reading. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, how did he know? Well, it had to be told to him somehow. Maybe they had a family meeting. Maybe Shem and Japheth were so concerned about Ham's actions that they felt the need to tell their father. Regardless of how. It's not the how, it's that he found out that's important here. Listen to what he says. This is kind of an oracle that Noah speaks. He says, "Cursed be Canaan." Now, Canaan is one of Ham's sons. Now, I don't know exactly why this curse fell upon Canaan. There's various views. Some speculate that he was already able to see some of the maybe the shortcomings in Canaan's life that were in Ham's life. Maybe he was just kind of thinking about what the future might hold. But nonetheless, the cursed be Canaan. The curse fell upon his son. It could also be, and I think this is very important for us to stop and think about, that our actions have long-term impacts. That'll probably be something I'll repeat again, but it's very important for us to think about that Ham needed to understand what he was doing, what he had already done, and what he was doing in his life at that moment was going to impact, either positively or negatively, his children, his grandchildren, even those descendants that he would never ever meet. His decisions now, just like Noah's decisions now, were going to impact future generations. He says, "A servant of servants shall be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." Notice the different language there. He invokes this covenant name of God when he references Shem. And so now we know that Christ was born through the line of Shem. And so here we see, is this because Shem is he already noticing that Shem is really a devoted follower of God? It certainly would sound that way. The God of Shem. And let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Again, here, this subtle lifting up of Shem. Now, we know through the New Testament lens that Christ comes through this line. But is Noah already seeing at least some elements that of his three sons, Shem is the one who has the most Godward focus? Well, it could certainly be that way. And let Canaan be his servant, into verse 27. So Canaan, the line of Ham, I won't say it's directly because of Ham's decision, that singular decision. I think we get lost in the weeds if we start focusing on, well, this one singular decision. This is about character traits. This is about who we are. And who we are fleshes itself out in individual decisions that we make. So don't get lost there in the particulars of this. You've got to back up kind of that elevated view and see that it's the character, it's the integrity that it's here that we really need to focus on. Verse 28, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. We've talked about that phrase, and he died, as we go through the generations of Genesis. That it's just kind of a subtle reminder of what God said in the garden: you will die. Hebrews 9:27, and it's for each man to die once. It is appointed to each man to die once, and that's just that subtle reminder of our humanity. I want you just to stop and think. I want you to listen to this quote. This is by a guy by the name of Alan Ross. He wrote a great commentary on the book of Genesis, creation and blessing. And I hope this is just a good kind of reiteration of some of the things that I have been briefly saying in this video. He writes, "It seems almost incredible that a relatively minor event would have such major repercussions. But consistently in Genesis, one finds that the fate of both people and nations is determined by occurrences with the ancestors that seem trivial and commonplace. Out of the virtues and vices of Noah's sons grew the virtues and vices of the families of the world." That's well said. Now I want you to stop and think about Noah's actions, and Ham's actions, and Shem and Japheth's actions. And I want you to try to put them in the context of your own life and in the life of your family. I know personally I can look at mistakes that I've made as a husband and a father, and I can see it play out in my kids at times. All right, I can look at times where I've made mistakes as a teacher in the classroom, and I can see it play out in the lives of my students. And I imagine that we can all see that. And that's what this story, and it's not just a story, this event in Noah's life is so powerful because it helps us and it reminds us to see that. We might look at some things as commonplace or even trivial, to use Ross's language, but they're anything but. They have long-term consequences. So when we think about a Godward life, when we think about Asaph in Psalm 78, how he points to that the generations in the future may know. All right, we look at John 17 in the high priestly prayer when Jesus prays for his church, those that would believe. We've got to think long term. We've got to think out in the future so that it will impact our lives now. And so just a brief review. God's calling us to live a Godward life. And we see this in the book of Genesis. He is calling you to keep your eyes set upon him, thinking about the generations to come. Thinking about your life being Godward. Challenge you to stop and think about that expression, a Godward life. What does that look like? How does that flesh itself out in your daily life? I mean, surely it's reading and it's praise and it's devotion, but I encourage you to get really practical and think about how does that flesh itself out? What does it really look like? And I want you to stop and think about that God's calling us to finish strong. To finish strong. You know, we can't say that Noah didn't finish strong because there's several hundred years of his life that we don't have access to. But we know that we've watched him live a Godward life, and then and I won't say right at the end, but in this, towards the end of Genesis' account of his life, we see this falter. We see him get comfortable. We see him relax a little bit. And that's when things begin to go south. And so we see this in the New Testament as well. You know this is a verse that I love, but it applies so beautifully here. Acts 20:24, Paul says, "I do not account my life of any value nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course." If only I may finish my course. That's where Noah, he could have prayed that, right? And maybe he did. Maybe after this event, he woke up and said, "Oh my gosh, God, if only I can finish strong." So I challenge you to go back and to spend some time with this text. Think about where Noah went wrong and begin to pull it over into your life, because we have similar events in our own lives. Times where we've made some mistakes, we've gotten comfortable, and we've taken our eyes off of God. He's calling us to live a Godward life. And I pray that you'll give that life over to Him. Love you.